Hey everybody, welcome to this review session for APUSH Period 6, an American Pageant, 17th edition, chapters 22 through 26. We're going to walk through the study guide today in preparation for your upcoming test. So hopefully this will be helpful to you. In fact, if it is helpful for you, you know what you got to do. This is on YouTube. You got to like the video and subscribe, and that'll let me know to make some more of these if you think it's helpful. If not, don't do it, right? So we're going to walk through the study guide really quickly, and you can fill it out at home as we move along. So here we go. So the first thing we talked about when discussing this period 6 was Reconstruction. In fact, we started with the election of President Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was elected in 1868. He's probably the most popular person in the North. He's quite unpopular in the South, at least with the white population. So the reason why he is elected in 1868 is because he has overwhelming support from Black Americans, recently freed slaves that during Reconstruction were given the right to vote, and that right to vote was protected. He benefits greatly from that. He also benefits from kind of the playing up his role, his important role in winning the Civil War. The so-called Bloody Shirt campaign referred to the displaying of the glorification of the Civil War and the role Republicans played in the Union's victory, saying like, this is patriotism, support these people, support these Civil War veterans. His leadership style is that he governs like a general, oftentimes wasn't all that involved, and that led to a lot of corruption that took place during his time in office. But he is elected again in 1872, at least partly because he went up against a very kind of weak candidate in Horace Greeley. That was a marriage of Democrats and the liberal Republicans who were upset with his time in office, but again, did benefit greatly from the votes of Black Americans. There was a lot of corruption in his time in office, but understand Gilded Age politics are corrupt in general. They're corrupt in general. And in fact, some of the great examples of corruption of this age take place with like the whiskey ring in the Grant administration, the Credit Mobilier scandal, which involved kickbacks for railroad construction, the political bosses in the big cities, people like Boss Tweed with Tammany Hall, where in exchange for votes, graft and money went back to the political machine. In fact, Boss Tweed actually isn't brought down by the government so much as he's brought down by a cartoonist by the name of Thomas Nast, who kind of exposed all this. But corruption is very much the coin of the realm. The other important aspect of politics this time, the lifeblood, you might say, of both the Republicans and the Democrats, is, of course, political patronage, giving jobs to supporters and promising jobs for support. People are incredibly dedicated to their political parties back in those days, not necessarily because of policy differences. There aren't really any significant policy differences between the Democrats and the Republicans. Instead, it's these cultural issues. If you're from the South, you're a Democrat. If you're a Northerner, you're a Republican, unless you're in the cities, in which case you're probably a Democrat. And people are extraordinarily dedicated to those political parties. They identify with them, and that leads to very high voter turnout. In 1873, we have a panic. Panic in 1873. It was caused in no small part because of too much building factories and those sort of things that led to people unable to pay their loans and foreclosures and all of this sorts of thing. This leads to a depression. It throws people out of work, and it also has people beginning to ask, what should we do to solve this issue? And that comes to, the solution comes up with the currency question. Should we use gold or silver to back up our currency? It is in 1873, in reaction to this panic, that we have what critics would dub the crime of 73, in which silver was dropped as a support for our currency, and we go to the gold standard. And that issue of only focusing on gold will be a big issue in the years to come. Election of 1876. We got some serious problems in 1876. Most noteworthy, we don't know who won. We don't know who won three southern states in particular. It was unclear who had actually won the Electoral College. And if those three states went to the Republican candidate, Hayes, he would be elected president of the United States. But because the election was in so much dispute, on election day, election night, we don't know who won. A few weeks later, a commission is put together by Congress, made up of people from both parties. And it appears that a deal was struck, the so-called Compromise of 1877, in which Democrats said to the Republicans, we will allow you to win the presidency. You can win, get the votes, if the Republicans promise, if President Hayes promises, to remove the remaining federal troops from the South, the ones who were there protecting Black citizens. If you remove those troops from the South that had been there since the end of the Civil War, and let Democrats take over the southern states, you can have the presidency. And it appears that that was, in fact, what happened. And this leads to the South being a white man's country for years to come. Following the removal of the South, African Americans are discriminated against. Yes, they have the right to vote based upon the 15th Amendment. Yes, they're citizens based on the 14th Amendment, but the spirit of that constitutional amendment is basically ignored as we see things like literacy tests and grandfather clauses. There is intimidation and lynching designed to prevent African Americans from enjoying full citizenship and participation in our democracy. Many are locked into labor contracts through sharecropping that prevent, I should say, any upward mobility economically. The laws that were put in place that segregated everyone, white and Black in the South, are known as Jim Crow laws. And when these laws were challenged, the idea that you were separating people based upon race, it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And of course, in the notorious case, Plessy versus Ferguson, the court said that separate facilities were perfectly fine so long as they were equal, the so-called separate but equal doctrine that will remain in place for decades to come. So while there are problems with race relations in the South, there are also race relations in the West, in particular, horrible anti-Chinese discrimination. Chinese immigrants first came to this country in large numbers to look for gold as part of the gold rush in California. After that period was over, many thousands found work building the Transcontinental Railroad, in fact, doing the very dangerous work of building from the west toward the east. And after that was over, many settled in the developing cities and towns of the West, and they maintained their own culture, and they started businesses, and they faced a lot of discrimination because of that, because generally it was felt, particularly by other immigrant groups, that they were willing to work for low wages, and there was a fear that that would depress wages for others. And there's also the reality that simply their culture was so much different that it left them open to horrible discrimination. And there's violence against Chinese immigrants in the West. How did Congress react? They didn't react by protecting these people, by protecting their rights. Instead, the notorious Chinese Exclusion Act is signed into law, which bans further Chinese immigration to the United States and prevents those who are here already from obtaining citizenship. Not one of our better moments as a country. In 1880, we're going to have another election. The Republican Party is going to have a bit of an identity crisis. Are they people who believe in political patronage, or are they people who advocate for civil service reform? In other words, giving away jobs based on merit rather than political loyalty. And there are two camps of people. The so-called Republican stalwarts were those who said political patronage is great. That's the way it's always worked. But the half-breeds were the faction of the Republican Party who believed in civil service reform. And they said, no, we got to change this corrupt system, because it was becoming more and more apparent things are corrupt in the Gilded Age. Kind of the compromise candidate is James Garfield, a half-breed who advocated for reform, but his vice president is a person by the name of Chester A. Arthur, someone who owed his entire career to political patronage. We don't know what kind of president Garfield ultimately would have been, because sadly, just a few months into his time in office, he is assassinated. He's assassinated by Charles Guiteau. Charles Guiteau was a deranged, disgruntled office seeker who thought that he deserved a diplomatic appointment because he had supported Garfield in the election. And so he shoots him, and ultimately Garfield dies. This opened a lot of people's eyes, and they said, "Look how far this political patronage and corruption has gone. We've got to do something to reform the system." And the Pendleton Act is the response to that. The Pendleton Act tries to, for a small percentage of government jobs, allow for applicants for those jobs, require them to have a competitive examination. In other words, prove that they are qualified before they get a job. So that is the first meaningful bit of civil service reform, Pendleton Act, competitive exams. And it was signed, ironically, by now President Arthur, again, someone who had benefited from the old system. In 1884, we've got another election. The two candidates are Grover Cleveland and James Blaine. The issues are not much, right? Again, during the Gilded Age, Democrats and Republicans don't really disagree on many big policy issues. Instead, it was a mudslinging campaign that attacked the two on character issues, which was ironic for Grover Cleveland. He's known as Grover the Good. He's a very fiscally responsible person. Remember, we talked about the fact that when Grover was in office, he got concerned about the fact that the government had too much money, a surplus. And because he was concerned that that might lead to wasteful spending, he actually vetoed some bills, and he lowered the federal tariff so that the government would not take in so much revenue. That tariff issue is going to be the big issue of 1888. 1888 is an often forgotten election, but it leads to the election of Benjamin Harrison, the grandson of William Henry Harrison, the president who died after about 30 days in office. Harrison comes in and the tariff is raised. Harrison is in office for the first $1 billion Congress, which doesn't seem like much today. But it's a noteworthy election because here we have Benjamin Harrison, who loses the popular vote, but wins the Electoral College. Again, this happens multiple times throughout our history, and generally, it's pretty rough on presidents who come to office that way. That is why in 1892, it's Harrison v. Grover Cleveland again, and this time Cleveland wins. Let's talk a little bit about the economy. The railroad is the single biggest contributor to the changing economy. The railroad that was built throughout the North and now into the West turns the United States into one big market. In other words, now you can sell things throughout the entire country and not just regionally. The railroad changes time itself. It is the railroad that gets Congress to change time zones. And people make a lot of money on the railroad. People like Cornelius Vanderbilt, who started out in shipping and then moved to railroad building. He is one of the first great captains of industry. If you like them, if you don't like these people, you call them a robber baron, and you would accuse them of having acquired their wealth and power through less than honorable means. So you got Vanderbilt with railroads. You have Andrew Carnegie, who is a steel magnate, becomes the richest person in the country at one time, takes the Bessemer process of creating large-scale steel production, high-quality steel through the Bessemer process. And this is a great time to be in steel. Why? Because we're building railroads, or we're building cities, and he's going to corner the market on that. J.P. Morgan is the great financier of this year, a banker. See, if you hear his name today, it's J.P. Morgan Chase, the bank. James Duke, this is tobacco. Think Tobacco Road, North Carolina, Duke University. That's what it's named. A lot of these cats have universities named after them because, in fact, large philanthropic donations is how many of the universities of this era get their money. John D. Rockefeller, of course, corners the oil market, and oil with the internal combustion engine is growing. Some of the tactics they used to consolidate their power. Vertical versus horizontal integration. Vertical integration is something that Carnegie would use. In other words, you purchase every bit of everything you need in the entire production of goods. So if he's producing steel, he's going to buy not only the mines where the iron is produced, he's going to buy the steel plant, refinery, he's going to buy the railroads to ship it out. Every step in the ladder, vertical integration stays with one company. Horizontal integration is something Rockefeller was known for. He's buying up competitors. So instead of 5 oil companies, he's going to buy each one on the same level. So that's horizontal integration. And oftentimes they use pretty ruthless tactics to do this sort of stuff. And they justified it, of course, using social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is the idea that the corruption of Charles Darwin's ideas about evolution that lead to those who are best fitted will survive and thrive. In fact, Herbert Spencer coins the phrase survival of the fittest, which says essentially, if you're really wealthy, you deserve it. And you owe nothing to the people below because you have demonstrated the best abilities and intelligence and all these sort of things. It's natural that you're at the top. And you can be ruthless because ultimately that's going to lead to human progress. That doesn't mean that people were uncaring. Of course, the gospel of wealth is something that's written by Andrew Carnegie that says, the wealthy people have an obligation to society to contribute back. Now, they may not contribute back in the way that we think about it today, or you think about it today in terms of charitable donations, but there's a lot of schools, a lot of universities, a lot of theaters and libraries, and these sort of things are built because of the giving back of wealthy people at that time. And Andrew Carnegie, with his gospel of wealth, advocated for that. So that's the people at the top of society. Your average workers, though, they're looking to make an impact too. And so we see several important unions that are just barely bubbling up to the top. The National Labor Union is one of the first, kind of gets killed off in the depressions of the 1870s. The Knights of Labor is one you need to know. The Knights of Labor was basically open to everyone, with a few exceptions. If you were someone who toiled, you were part of the Knights of Labor, and they are really advocating for big systemic economic changes. They come to really suffer as a result of the Haymarket Square riot, which is where some anarchists during a labor rally set up a bomb. The Knights had nothing to do with it, probably, but they were tainted by the association with it. Probably the most successful is the American Federation of Labor under the leadership of Samuel Gompers. The American Federation of Labor was for skilled workers. It did exclude some people, but rather than big systemic changes like the Knights advocated for, they advocated for higher wages, shorter work hours, very kind of piecemeal, obtainable goals. And that's probably why the AFL still exists today. The AFL, the Knights of Labor, these different individuals are trying to make the workplace a more equitable area, oftentimes without the support, certainly, of the federal government. But there's also the problems in cities at this time. In fact, cities are becoming very overcrowded in part because of the wave of immigration that is coming into our country at this time. And there are new immigrants. The so-called new immigrants are immigrants from a different part of Europe than previous immigrants, the older stock immigrants. Generally, these people are culturally different than the previous white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. These are people from Eastern and Southern Europe. They're more likely to be Catholic. They're more likely to be Jewish or Orthodox. Their languages and their culture is different. And because of these different cultural aspects, they're oftentimes faced with a lot of hostility, unfortunately, by older immigrant groups. In light of these challenges, we see people beginning to try to address some of the challenges faced by immigrant groups. Jane Addams, for example, at Hull House. These are organizations designed to help immigrants adjust to life here in the United States through settlement houses. But they also focus on things like anti-sweatshop, anti-child labor laws, things of that. And there's a Christian aspect to this. Maybe not so much at the settlement houses, but certainly there's the social gospel that many prominent Protestant pastors advocated for, that said churches, Christian churches, need to address poverty. They need to address injustice within the cities. So Christianity is changing in that way, focusing on these issues. Christianity is also being, for many people, challenged because of the new ideas of Charles Darwin and evolution. And that's going to lead down the road toward a split within the Protestant movement, which we'll talk about at a future date. How did new research or modern American English differ from earlier ones? They become secularized. They are less associated with churches and religion and more associated with secular world, and oftentimes they get their money through large charitable donation, as we mentioned earlier. That's why a lot of those cats we mentioned have universities named after them. Compare and contrast the views of prominent African-American leaders Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. This is super, super important, so make sure to write this down. Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois are the two most prominent African-American leaders of the late 1800s, early 1900s. They are very different. While they both want to make the world a more equitable place, Washington, born a slave in the South, focuses on industrial education, economic needs. Basically, his argument is this: do not push too much for social or political equality. Focus on making sure that African Americans have the tools they need to get jobs and provide for themselves economically, so they do not have to be in the service of the white population. Maybe in time, political and economic equality might come. But right now, his life experience tells him focusing on economic stability, industrial education, is probably the most important. W.E.B. Du Bois disagrees with this. Du Bois is not born in the South or a slave. He's born in the North after slavery. He is someone who goes to Harvard, and he's first African-American to get a PhD from Harvard. And he says, yes, you need to challenge the injustice in the world through the political system, through the court system. He advocates for what he calls the talented 10th. That's a term you need to know. The talented 10th. He says the African-American population of this country will benefit when the most talented, elite educated people, formally educated people, lead them to a better day through challenging things in the courts, running for office, these sort of things. He's not so big on the industrial education. And to that end, he is a founder of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It does, in fact, challenge many of these laws. In our final part, let's talk about going out west. Go west, young man. What were some of the reasons why Indians fought against whites? Because the whites were taking their land. When the railroads come in, it brings with it a new wave of white migration. And there is simply a fundamental cultural misunderstanding about what land is for. To many Plains Indians who are nomadic, who rely on the buffalo, who travel, who live in teepees and move around, the idea that an individual would own land and farm it makes no sense to them. The idea that, from the American perspective, trying to sign treaties with the leader of any one tribe really was not a thing that happened. There was no president, right, of the Sioux Nation, for example. And so cultural misunderstanding leads to conflict. Oftentimes treaties would be signed, and more often than not, treaties would not be followed by the United States government. And that is a big part of why there's conflict. In fact, in 1874, there's conflict. Why? Because George Armstrong Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills, sacred land for Sioux, Native Americans, Sioux Indians, that was supposed to only be for them. He takes them in there looking for gold, and sure enough, they find gold, and more white settlers come in, and that is why the Sioux left. And this ultimately leads to the battle of Little Bighorn, which is really the one time that the Native Americans have a massive victory over the army. But after 1874, the movement to make sure the Native Americans are on reservations really picks up steam. And how are they put there? Well, they're put there by being defeated on the battlefield But ultimately, what leads to them being defeated and put onto reservations, it's that railroad that brings all the new people in, and it is the extermination of the buffalo that was intentional. The extermination of the buffalo gets rid of that creature so that the land can be farmed and used by white people, but also it is the resource that keeps Native Americans alive. And without that resource, these nomadic people are quite desperate. Um, by the late 1880s, there are people who are beginning to question the treatment of Native Americans. Century of Dishonor is a book written that outlines the, at this point, century of horrible treatment toward Native Americans. And there are humanitarians who say we need to take a different approach. The important part is that humanitarians and hardliners alike do not respect Native American culture. They may view the treatment of them as good or bad, depending on their perspective, but they don't really respect the culture. And that's why we move into a period of assimilation. Assimilation, there's two different things the government does with the assimilation movement you should be aware of. Number one is through the Native American schools, the Indian schools. Remember, they're taking children away from their families and they're putting them in these horrible schools with the idea of killing the Indian to save the man. And we know now about the long-term negative effects of that. There's also the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act was designed for assimilation. It dissolved tribal ownership of land and divided it up to try to make Native Americans into farmers. And it didn't really work out too well. Out of desperation for the horrible situation so many are in, many Native Americans turned to their faith. They turned to their religion. And we can see that with the ghost dance movement. The ghost dance movement was supposed to be a spiritual awakening, which would turn the buffalo and those sort of things. It's misunderstood by the army in the West and ultimately leads, sadly, to the massacre at Wounded Knee that really puts an end to the Indian Wars. With Indians gone, the West becomes the white man's land. The first big industry in the West is mining, actually, and hydraulic mining changes the landscape of the West. And the biggest source of silver that's found in the West is actually placed in the Comstock lode in Nevada. So mining for gold and other silver and other minerals is the big industry that first changes everything. But then we have agriculture. The Homestead Act, passed in 1862, is a law that essentially gives away 160 acres to any American or immigrant who wants it for a small filing fee. People moved out west for this free land giveaway. Many took advantage of it. But the truth is, in the dry, harsh climate of the Great Plains, 160 acres really wasn't enough to be profitable, and the living conditions were terrible. And as a result, many people do go home, and the government will change the policy to give it to more and more people. But ultimately, this is a massive land giveaway. The government is intentionally populating the West. The government plays a central role in conquering the West, whether it is the removal of Native Americans, the subsidizing of railroads, or in this case, giving away massive amounts of land. The farmers who do stay overwhelmingly, they focus on producing one cash crop. They do not become Thomas Jefferson's dream of the yeoman farmer providing for themselves. Instead, they produce one cash crop like corn or wheat or barley, and they're not independent. Rather, they are dependent on banks for loans to buy the things they need to farm, and they're dependent on railroads to take their goods to market. And all of that leads to a lot of troubles for the farmers. The prices are falling for their crops, and their productivity is going up, and they're being taken advantage of by railroads and by banks, and they cannot pay their mortgages. And so they eventually decide to organize themselves. First was something called the Grange. The Grange looks at meeting the needs of various farmers, and primarily they're focused on regulating railroads, which they try to do at a state level. The outgrowth of the Grange turns into the Populist Party. The Populist Party organizes in Kansas. They take over the Kansas legislature. They run a national platform. In fact, in 1892, they put forward James Weaver, a presidential candidate who wins several states. They elect people to state legislatures and Congress, and they have a pretty broad platform. It involves things like the nationalization of the railroads, um, essentially turn the railroads into a utility. It involves term limits on presidents, a shorter workday, um, immigration restriction. They didn't want immigrants competing for jobs. And this populist movement gains a lot of traction. Again, beginning in Kansas, and it grows until it turns into the People's Party. The People's Party and the populists are the same thing. And of course, they advocate for inflationary policies through the coinage of silver. That goes back to that crime of 73 we talked about before. The Populist Party gains strength. And in 1893, there is a panic, the worst we'd ever had to that point. And it disproportionately affects the people at the bottom of society, the people who work for a living. And the same sentiment of there are systems that are screwing us over can be seen with Jacob Coxey. Jacob Coxey is a man who leads an army. It's just a march on Washington. And in the 1890s, marching to Washington to advocate that the government, to alleviate the massive unemployment, put a lot of men to work repairing roads, to do meaningful improvement. And it picks up steam, and they march, and they go to Washington, and ultimately Jacob Coxey is arrested for walking on the government's grass, and the whole thing falls apart. But this was an important step. The idea that people would advocate for the government doing something to improve their life economically, pretty significant. Finally, in 1896, there's another presidential election, one of the most important in history. And it's interesting because in this election, the populists do not put forward a candidate. Rather, they endorse the Democratic candidate, William Jennings Bryan, because the Democratic candidates have embraced some of the populist idea, most importantly, the free coinage of silver. And that issue, the coinage of silver, will be the most important issue of the 1896 election, the so-called currency question. Are you in favor of bimetallism, gold and silver, or are you a gold bug? Are you only in favor of gold backing up our currency? So 1896, the Democrat is William Jennings Bryan, who has supported the Democratic Party and the populist, the People's Party. And then the Republicans put forward a candidate, which is William McKinley, a big business Republican with the support of the captains of industry and all that. We're in favor of gold. We're in favor of more what we would understand as conservative economic policy. Ultimately, William McKinley will be elected president, and the populist movement will begin to die down over time. All right. So that's a lot. But I hope it helped you. I hope you filled out your study guide as we went through it together. And ultimately, I hope you are feeling prepared for test. Again, if you think this is helpful, I know it sounds silly, but if you think this is helpful, do like the video and subscribe, and I will make more of them in the future if it turns out that it's helpful. All right, sounds good, sounds great. Best of luck.